To be the absolute best in the world at any sport is an extreme rarity, but to maintain this spot for any prolonged period of time, well, that puts you amongst the true outliers of our species. Jon Brzenk is that person, and so much more in the world of arm wrestling. This is part 1 of a multi-part series covering every stage of Brzenk's career, from his early days pulling in school hallways to striking fear in his opponents' hearts across the arm wrestling table. So if you're into the history of the sport of arm wrestling and want to follow this entire journey, hit that subscribe button because there's a lot more coming. Before he was the perfect storm, Jon Brzenk was just a kid with a strong grip and a father who set him on the path to greatness. I am the Arm Historian, and in this video, we'll dive into Brzenk's childhood, his first taste of competition, and how he fared in his first real arm wrestling tournaments, back to where it all began.
Jon Brzenk Jr. is such an impressive competitor. I mean, he is so quick.
Jon Brzenk was born on July 15, 1964, in the city of McHenry, Illinois, USA. McHenry is a relatively small city, named after a US Army officer in the Black Hawk War, nearly 2 centuries ago. Jon's father, Jon Brzenk Sr., owned a bowling alley and would often man the bar in the establishment. According to Brzenk Jr., his dad was a naturally strong man who liked to lift weights to stay in shape. Contrary to popular belief though, Jon's first experiences with arm wrestling wasn't with his father. As a young kid, now barely a teenager, Jon had built up the habit of arm wrestling with 5 to 6 kids at his local school before classes would start for the day. Even though in his own words he wasn't the best at the sport right away, he kept this up for multiple years, ultimately conditioning his young body for what was to come. It wasn't until Jon was 13 that he would first encounter an actual arm wrestling table, something that would end up changing his life forever. A couple years before, Jon's father, Brzenk Sr., heard about a local arm wrestling tournament from one of his patrons and sought out the competition. Since then, Brzenk Sr. seems to have immersed himself somewhat in the sport, becoming very successful at it himself. Jon Brzenk Jr. showed interest in and had a natural knack for the sport himself, and at the age of 13 found himself arm wrestling people much older than him. One of them was a friend of his father who was a local flyweight champion, and who gave Jon such a fight that the young Brzenk ended up breaking his own elbow. Jon would later credit this break at such an early age for potentially having strengthened his arm and tendons, but at the time it happened, Jon decided to take a step back from arm wrestling. Although he would still go back to McHenry during the summer months, during which periods he did arm wrestle, he moved out to Utah for the rest of the year with his mother and had little to no opportunities to actually practice the sport. When he was about to start his senior year in high school, now aged 17, Jon moved back out to Illinois and started practicing competitive arm wrestling consistently with his father. Brzenk Sr. would attend local tournaments, often in bars, and started taking his son along with him. To a young Jon Brzenk, still being underage, going along to these establishments and entering these rowdy tournaments must have been quite a formative experience. He remembers his first ever tournament had about 6 people in his weight class. Back then he was still a lightweight, and also remembers winning twice in that initial tournament, after which he lost versus a friend of his father. Not easily deterred though, Jon joined his father almost every other week, all the while growing in size and arm wrestling prowess. While ingratiating himself in the local Chicago arm wrestling scene, Jon quickly befriended a local champ named Ron Widener, someone who he would end up training with for the following 3 to 4 years. One of Ron's friends, who often traveled up from the south to compete in arm wrestling, was arguably even more essential to Jon's arm wrestling development. Burt Whitfield was an accomplished arm wrestler who had a lot of experience to impart on the young Jon. He was the first one to introduce Brzenk to actual arm wrestling techniques, teaching Jon about a proper top roll and hook. Burt Whitfield would end up becoming one of many mentor figures that John would end up meeting along the early stages of his career, something that undoubtedly had a tremendous effect on his current status as the greatest of all time. By this time, John had also taken up a job as an airline mechanic, something that afforded him the opportunity to cheaply travel nearly anywhere. Or in other words, wherever there was an arm wrestling tournament, John would go. During the early 80s, now fully committed to the sport of arm wrestling, John would travel with his training partners to numerous smaller tournaments in the area, often attending a tournament every 1 or 2 weeks. John's crew would also sometimes travel to bigger tournaments throughout the nation, making their way over to Vegas and Petaluma, amongst other locations. John's father also stayed heavily involved with the sport, even co-organizing some tournaments in the US and still competing and doing well at nationals. In fact, John Sr. and Jr. would both win 2 weight classes each in the 1982 IWC Nationals. Also, as a side note, John's aunt, Fran Brzenk, just like her brother John Brzenk Sr., was also a formidable arm wrestler in her own right, winning multiple national and world titles in the late 70s and early 80s. John also has a younger brother named Bill, who would later become quite strong the arm wrestler himself, although around this time he was more into riding his BMX bike. Bill will for sure return in a later part of this series. John Brzenk Jr. himself won his first world title at a little-known tournament called the Sit-Down Wrist Wrestling World Championships in Ontario, Canada. John won his weight class outright by defeating the accomplished puller Harley Maynard in the finals. The winners of each weight class, also including Johnny Walker and Cleve Dean, received their well-earned prize money in the form of checks. Checks that would unfortunately end up bouncing, leaving the winners, John included, empty-handed. At the time, John mainly relied on his overpowering hand strength and speed for hitting his opponents off-center. His no-holds-barred style, combined with an ever-growing arsenal of moves, meant the young, unassuming John was often underestimated. It didn't take long, though, until people in the greater arm wrestling community were talking about the young Prodigy, hailing him to be the next big thing in the sport in some cases. He would eventually prove his peers right, beating big names in the sport well above his own weight class. In January of 1984, at the Sands Can-Am Arm Wrestling Championship in Reno, for example, John absolutely demolished 3 different weight classes and even beat legendary arm wrestlers Virgil Arciero and Johnny Walker, with the win over Walker being especially meaningful to the young Brzenk. 2 years now out of high school, in the summer of 1984, John moved out to Virginia for about half a year. It was here where he would meet and start training with one of the other big influencers of his career. Dave Patton, a legendary arm wrestler of the early days in his own right, taught John about the importance of being a good winner and loser. He would also impart on John the importance of an unforgiving setup and the ability on how to overcome larger opponents, effectively showing John that size doesn't mean everything in arm wrestling. Dave also stressed the importance of back pressure, especially when pulling in the straps. Until this day, John maintains he still pulls exactly as Dave taught him when strapped to his opponents. In that same year, John would compete at what was his biggest tournament yet at the World Wrist Wrestling Championships in Petaluma, California. Dave Patton ended up winning the featherweight division of the tournament, and John himself ended up in the finals of the lightweight division after beating Alan Fisher in the semifinals. John ended up winning the finals as well, and thus became, once again, now at the age of 20, a world champion arm wrestler.
Did you have any idea when you left home in your car to drive all the way out here that you would wind up world champion? You're still a rookie, 20 years old.
Yeah, I felt my chances were pretty good. I've been looking forward for this for about 2 years now. It feels great.
At this time, John had little competition in his weight class, but was still not truly undisputed at the true top of the sport. Johnny Walker, at this point still considered one of, if not the greatest arm wrestler ever, still gave John issues on the table, as evidenced by John coming in 4th at the 1984 NFL Super Classic, behind not only Johnny Walker, but also behind Clay Rosenkrantz and John Woolsey, all 3 legendary pullers of arm wrestling's nascency. In August of 1985, an opportunity would present itself to John Brzenk and to the arm wrestling world at large. The Over the Top World Championships was conceived as a way to promote the upcoming Sylvester Stallone movie, Over the Top, which heavily featured the sport of arm wrestling as a storytelling device. Unlike the traditional tournaments Brzenk had frequented, Over the Top was designed to be a spectacle. The competition spanned several regional qualifiers across North America, culminating in an 18-hour marathon finals at the Las Vegas Hilton 1 year on. John participated in the very first qualifier held in Beverly Hills, securing his place in the finals by winning it outright. The qualifiers weren't just a North American affair though, with several other qualifying tournaments being held all over the world. This meant that Over the Top had basically secured the highest level of competition available in arm wrestling at that time. On the day of the final event, the competition featured 3 divisions: professional, military, and the truckers class. The truckers class was specifically for teamsters and truck drivers, a category that was open to competitors who worked in the transportation industry. Thanks to his job with Delta Airlines and his status as a teamster, Brzenk was eligible to enter the truckers division, and happily did so.
I don't know the specifics behind the reasoning of why they wanted the winner to have a truck driver's license, but initially when they did the qualifying event, the rule was if you were a trucker or a teamster, you could be qualified to wrestle for this big rig that they were giving away. Well, at the time, I was working for Western Airlines as a line mechanic, and we so happened to be teamsters. So I was like, hey, here's my teamster card. I'm a teamster.
He ended up winning the heavyweight truckers class after a grueling 18-hour-long event, winning the coveted main prize truck and trailer. In retrospect, Over the Top wasn't just a one-off event, it was a launching pad for John Brzenk's enduring legacy. The tournament's high-profile nature, bolstered by its connection to Hollywood, transformed the way arm wrestling was perceived by the public. Brzenk's victory in the truckers class remains one of the most memorable moments in the sport's history, illustrating that brilliance on the table isn't solely measured by muscle mass, but by the art of arm wrestling itself, expressed by this young man from Illinois. John ended up collecting the truck a year later, after it had gone on an extensive press tour, and subsequently sold it, together with the trailer, for what was approximately $170,000, a sum that amounts to quite possibly the biggest arm wrestling prize purse ever, especially when adjusted for inflation. After his notorious win in the truckers division of Over the Top, John's main competition of the time in Cleve Dean and Scott Norton both stepped away from the sport, leaving John Brzenk to go on an incredible undefeated run during the next few years and claim the spot as absolute #1 arm wrestler in the world. All this and more in the next video of our John Brzenk series, which you won't want to miss. A major shout out to the Armies and Fingerfolk for your continued support, and until next time, Arm Historian, out.